This is GARIS Essays, that is 2-3 page opinion pieces on topics such as species dominance, the global state, politics, femtotech, religion, society and education. Written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. This is essay number 20, entitled How Will the Artilect War Start? By Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This chapter attempts to predict with a greater level of detail than I have in the past in writings and videos how I think the Artilect War will start. It should be obvious to anybody that if I'm correct in saying that a great war is coming, killing billions of people, giga-death, over the issue of species dominance, that is, should humanity build artilects, that's artificial intellects, godlike massively intelligent machines with mental capacities trillions of times above the human level, or not, then these events will be the most significant to happen to humanity this century, a realization that is both humbling and extremely sobering. Before I start making predictions, giving more or less a step-by-step timeline on how I see things heating up, leading eventually to war, let me begin by spelling out the issue that lies behind the biggest question of the 21st century, that is, should humanity build artilects? Thus relegating human beings to species number 2 on the planet. I'm a numbers person. Now that I'm formally retired, I spend my time making YouTube lecture course videos and electronic libraries with links to full content books in PhD level pure math and math physics, plus a few other topics, as a globicator, that's global educator, helping to teach the planet for free. For me, the prediction that artilects could mentally outclass the human brain by a factor of trillions of times is the writing on the wall. The rest is just detail: when, where, how, etc. In the next few decades, that is, not in the 22nd century, but within the lifetimes of most readers, humanity will be able to put more computing capacity in a single grain of nanotech sand than the estimated equivalent of the human brain by a factor of a quintillion, 1,000,000 trillion times. This giant number comes from a phys-comp, that's physics of computation, type calculation, which I will give here since it is the basis of the whole discussion of this chapter and the dominant underlying reality of 21st century politics. Within a decade or so, technology will be manipulating a bit of information using only one atom. Recently, IBM used 12 atoms to store 1 bit of information. Quantum optics says that an atom can change its state in femtoseconds, 1,000th of a trillionth of a second. One can really estimate the number of atoms in a grain of sand of 1 cubic millimeter, and then estimate the total number of bit flips per second of the grain of sand and compare it to the estimated information handling capacity of the human brain, measured in equivalent bit flips per second. The human brain bit flip rate is estimated to be about 10 to the power 16 bits per second, which is found by multiplying the number of neurons, that's brain cells, in the human brain, which is about 100 billion, times the number of connections, or synapses, on average between one neuron and its neighbours, which is about 10,000, times the maximum signalling rate across synapses, which is about 10 bits per second. The product of these three numbers, 10 to the power 11 times 10 to the power 4 times 10 to the power 1 is 10 to the power 16. That's 11 plus 4 plus 1. This is the same as today's fastest supercomputers. Thus, our computers have already a high enough bit processing rate to equal that of the human brain. So quite a milestone. But the grain of sand has its atoms flipping in femtoseconds. One can estimate the number of atoms in a cubic millimeter, the size of a grain of sand. A handheld object contains Avogadro's number, that is a trillion of atoms. Let us assume the cubic millimeter contains 10 to the power 19 atoms. So the bit flip rate of the grain of sand is 10 to the power 19 times 10 to the power 15, which is 10 to the power 34. This is 10 to the power 18 times larger than the bit flip information processing rate of the human brain, that is a million trillion times more. Thus, the near future capacity of our artificial brains is vastly superior to our own biological brains. This is the basic political reality of our century. Sometimes I wish there were more math physicists in the humanity plus, transhumanist, etc. movements. I get annoyed with their myopia and failure to appreciate the enormity of the mental superiority of the Artilects relative to humans. When the transhumanists talk about upgrading human mental capacities, for example more memory, greater intelligence, immortality, etc., I feel annoyed. They are not seeing the big picture. The big picture that I have taken some trouble to elaborate above is that humanity will not be superseded by a being that is somewhat superior to humans, but rather astronomically superior by a factor of trillions of times. Thus I have always felt that the dominant issue of the 21st century will not be about global warming, nor a nuclear holocaust, mass starvation, overpopulation, viral outbreaks, etc., but over species dominance. That is, should humanity build Artilects, yes or no? Now let's talk about the beginning of the build-up to the Artilect War. As I see it, there are two broad strategies towards building human-level artificial intelligence and above. One I call the engineering approach, for example, as taken by Ben Gersel with his AGI, that's Artificial General Intelligence approach. That is, take a purely engineering approach, trying out any ideas one wishes, to give an artificial intelligence the ability to solve general problems. I'm somewhat cynical that this approach will work, since it is the approach that AI researchers have been taking for 60 years and have failed to produce intelligent machines. But you could argue that it's only now that a sufficient bit processing rate has been achieved in our computers. The second broad strategy is the copy the brain approach. Obviously, if AI researchers, intelligists, copy the human brain closely enough, sooner or later they will create artificial brains having human-level intelligence and consciousness. Science knows in principle that inherent in our DNA lies the solution to producing an intelligent, conscious creature. We have the existence proof of ourselves that nature has found a way, through evolution, to self-assemble molecules into such a creature. This approach is the one I prefer, and predict will be the first to achieve human-level artificial intelligence. Others agree, for example, Henry Markram's Blue Brain project and Ray Kurzweil's Google Artificial Brain project. There are major problems with both approaches. With the engineering approach, one can only engineer something if one knows what the something is, and in this case the something is intelligence. My suspicion is that the reason why the engineering approach intelligists have failed to build intelligent machines over the past 60 years is they just don't know what intelligence is, and hence cannot engineer it. The main problem of the copy the brain approach intelligists is that they don't yet know enough about the principles of the functioning of the human brain to be able to put them into machines. But progress in neuroscience knowledge is exponential, so quite possibly by the end of the 2020s, neuroscience will have a pretty good knowledge of the broad principles of brain functioning, which can then be copied rapidly by the brain builders. I would now like to provide some labels for the stages of development of the consciousness of the species dominance issue. Phase 0 was when no one was conscious of the issue. Phase 1 was the intellectuals crying in the wilderness phase. For example, I.J. Good in the 1960s, Moravec and myself in the 1980s. Phase 2 was the interest groups phase in the 1990s and 2000s. For example, organizations such as the Transhumanists and Humanity Plus. Phase 3 I label the mainstream phase, that is, when the media becomes fully conscious of the issue and passes it on en masse to the general public through blockbuster Hollywood movies, newspaper stories, magazine articles, etc. In 2014, a blockbuster Warner Brothers movie, Transcendence, will be released, which should unnerve the public, since this movie is based on the warnings of Intelligence. In fact, I suspect the scriptwriters of this movie were influenced by my book, The Artilect War, or my videos on YouTube. For example, the star of the movie, a brain builder, was fatally wounded by the Rift, an anti-AI terrorist organization, a relabeling of my term Terrans, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Once the masses become conscious of the species dominance issue, the time will then be ripe for professional opinion polls to be taken on the question of whether Artilect should be built or not. At the time of writing, January 2014, the intelligents who worry about the species dominance issue are really only guessing at how the mass of humanity will react when push really comes to shove. That is, when the IQ gap between human intelligence and machine intelligence seriously starts to close. I've taken some preliminary surveys on the question, is an Artilect war likely over the issue of species dominance? The first time I did this in 2011 to a group of electrical engineers, 60% thought yes, which shocked me. Even half of ultra-optimistic Humanity Plus members thought that there was a significant risk that humanity could be wiped out by the rise of advanced Artilects. Once Phase 3 is well developed, and I'm hoping the Transcendence movie will play a major role in this, it will be very useful to have the results of opinion polls indicating what percentage of people are in favour of building Artilects, that is, cosmists, as I call them, what percentage are opposed, that is, Terrans, and what percentage want to become cyborgs, that is, cybernetic organisms, that is, part machine, part human, by adding artilectual components to their own brains, thus converting their human cells bit by bit, pun intended, into Artilect gods. I would very much like to see the establishment of a new branch of sociology called Artilect Sociology, to investigate which types of people tend to be cosmists, Terrans, cyborgists, etc. With such sociological data, a lot of the guesswork will be taken out of predicting whether an Artilect war is likely or not. Phase 4 is the political phase and is the main theme of this chapter. Once everyone is aware of the species dominance issue, I see a great debate, the species dominance debate, heating up. I predict this debate will really get going in the 2020s when people notice their home robots becoming smarter and smarter every year. Our current decade, the 2010s, is the decade of artificial brain research, with such projects popping up like mushrooms now that Moore's law, that is, that the number of transistors on a chip keeps doubling every year or two, has made building artificial brains practical. In the 2020s, I predict, enough progress will have been made in neuroscience to enable the brain builders to be able to control home robots, giving them enough intelligence to be useful, but not yet so intelligent as to be threatening. Our home robots will become genuinely useful and intelligent. A huge industry will blossom, worth trillions of RMB a year. I'm expecting the US dollar to lose its status as the international reserve currency within a year or so, with the Chinese RMB taking its place. People will be prepared to spend more money on a truly useful home robot that can walk the dog, clean the house, babysit the kids, entertain its owners, amuse them, sex them, educate them, etc., than for a car. National governments will create ABAs, ABA, as artificial brain administrations, equivalent to NASA, to promote artificial brain research and development for their national artificial brain industries. The economic momentum in this direction will be enormous and virtually unstoppable. A similarly unstoppable military momentum will be built up with the growing political and ideological rivalry between the US and China for global dominance. With such a heavy financial investment in the national artificial brain industries, progress in the artificial intelligence levels of the home robots and other such products will only increase year by year. Billions of people around the world will notice with their own eyes that their own home robots are becoming smarter and smarter as they upgrade their old models for new ones. I believe that it'll be in the 2020s that Phase 4, the political phase, really takes off. Everyone will be asking the same questions. Could these machines become smarter than humans? Could they become a lot smarter? If so, is there a risk that they might turn against us, seeing us as rivals, or even worse, as pests? Should a legal upper limit be imposed on their level of artificial intelligence? Could such a limit be enforced? As I write this, I'm in my later 60s, so I expect to see this species dominance debate raging well before I die. A lot is at stake, namely the survival of the human species. For example, in the major wars of the 20th century, up to 100 million people died, for example in World War II. Such wars were fought between nation-states, where the stake was the survival of one country versus another, for example when Stalin was fighting Hitler's invasion of Russia. However, if a great war occurs in the 21st century over species dominance, it's likely to be a global civil war, and the stake will be the highest it has ever been, namely not the survival of nation-states, but the survival of the human species. Hence the passion level of the debate will be the highest it has ever been. The species dominance debate will then be taken out of the hands of the techies, the intelligists, and spread amongst a broader range of disciplines, for example, the social scientists, the political scientists, sociologists, historians, philosophers, etc. They will bring a more balanced view of the rise of the Artilect, considering the benefits with the risks. As the IQ gap between humans and machines seriously begins to close in the 2020s and 2030s, the temperature of the species dominance debate will rise. I expect to see it and contribute to it, which is what I'm doing now, I suppose, in writing this chapter, book chapter. So how will Phase 4 unfold? This is the theme of this chapter. Predicting events in detail in such a complex situation is hazardous, so I can only give a broad outline of what I think will happen. I predict, well before 2020, the first opinion polls will be out, showing that what the general public thinks about the species dominance issue. The home robot industry will be already established, and the IQ gap will already be starting to close. The gap will get small in the 2020s, and the temperature of the debate will rise. Then I suspect whole new political parties will be formed over the issue. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the dominant political question was economic, namely Marx, that's Karl Marx's question, who should own capital? Who should own the means of production? Private individuals or the state, that is, the capitalists, or the communalists, or communists. Humanity almost wiped itself out in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis over this question. Such a question seems trivial in comparison with the question whether humanity should build Artilects this century, and hence replace ourselves as the planet's dominant, that is most intelligent, species. Usually the names of political parties reflect the answers to the dominant questions of their historical era. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the political party names reflected such answers, for example, socialist, communist, liberal, fascist, etc. In the 2020s and 2030s, we will probably see new parties with labels such as cosmist, transcendent, etc. for the cosmos viewpoint, and humanity, Terran, etc. for the Terran viewpoint, and cyborg, transhuman, etc. for the cyborgist viewpoint. As the temperature of the species dominance debate heats up, we will see the beginnings of political actions in the form of assassinations and sabotage. Hollywood often anticipates future trends, which is not surprising, since they don't have to do the hard work of researching and designing artificial brains / Artilects. They merely put their fantasies into film. Nevertheless, Hollywood is probably correct in anticipating that the Terrans will go on an assassination and sabotage campaign to keep human beings the dominant species. Within a mere few years from the time of writing, we should know, via the opinion polls, if this scenario is probable. The obvious initial strategy of the Terrans will be to kill the top brain builders and to sabotage the brain building companies and their CEOs. So companies like IBM and Google will soon have to increase their security levels significantly. They will be targeted. Prominent artificial brain researchers will have their quality of life drastically reduced due to the constant threat of being hit by a Terran assassin's bullet. It's likely that the Transcendence movie may prove to be prophetic in this regard. The Cyborgists, on the other hand, think that a confrontation between Cosmists and Terrans can be avoided by simply going around the problem, by having virtually everyone becoming cyborgs. This view is naive in my opinion. I think the Terrans will argue that there's little difference, given the huge computational capacity of nanotech matter, between a cyborg and a pure Artilect. A cyborg is just an Artilect in human disguise, whose mental capacities are 99.99999% Artilect and 0.00001% human. The Terrans will simply lump the Cyborgists and the Cosmists into the same ideological camp. Once we have Artilect sociology, we'll be able to see this more clearly. In fact, the paranoia of the Terrans will be all the greater due to the presence of cyborgs. The Terrans will not be able to distinguish cyborgs from humans just by looking at their bodies. When the IQ gap has almost closed, the leaders of the new political parties will be planning for their worst-case scenarios, which in the case of the Terrans will be that the Artilects wipe out humanity. To the Terrans, top priority is that humans should remain the dominant species, and when push really comes to shove, they will wipe out the Cosmists and Cyborgists to preserve the existence of billions of human beings. As alluded to above, the Terran politicians will probably undertake an assassination strategy, arguing that there's not much point, at least initially, in killing off everyone who expresses sympathy towards the Cosmos view, that is, seeing humanity as the stepping stone in building Artilect gods, climbing the next rung up the evolutionary ladder, etc. Because only the intellectual elite has enough intelligence to build artificial brains. Without them, the less intelligent pro-Cosmos sympathizers are ineffectually irrelevant. The Terran leaders will target their assassinations towards the source of the species dominance problem, namely the brain builders themselves, that is, the artificial brain architects, the brain building companies, the ABBAs, that's, what did I say it was? Artificial brain administrations, like NASA, the ABBAs, the political leaders of the Cosmists and the Cyborgists. The early political actions will probably be of this form. Prominent proponents of cyborgism and cosmism will be assassinated. Of course, the Cosmist and Cyborgist leaders will not sit idly by while their colleagues are being killed. They will quickly start doing the same with the Terran leaders, and this is probably how the Artilect War will start. It will probably be a global civil war, as I suggested above. I think this because the internet speed keeps doubling every year. Already the US and the EU are combining economic forces to match the economic weight of the billion club members of China and India. The EU has 28 countries at the time of writing, 2014. In the democratic countries, about 130 of 190, a world community is already growing. English is already the world language, and more people speak at least two languages, their own local national language and the world language. Nearly 1 billion people travel internationally each year, so we are rapidly becoming globans, speaking the world language and hence becoming increasingly culturally homogeneous. It's quite likely that we may even be living within the beginnings of a global state called Globa, G-L-O-B-A, by the end of the 2030s. If so, Globa's dominant issue will be species dominance. Globa's democratic parliament will be split passionately across rival answers to the species dominance question. Where is it likely that the first political actions will take place? Question mark. One of the reasons I'm living in China is that I see China taking the lead on this critical question. For the moment, it's the US that is leading the species dominance debate. It's currently the dominant scientific and intellectual power, but China's potential to surpass the US is so great that I chose nearly a decade ago to settle in China so that I can help China become conscious of the question that will dominate its and the planet's political future. Ad-libbing now, I've run out of patience. I'm fed up with this Chinese shithole, so I will leave in a year or so once I've finished off a bit of work that I'm doing here now. To most Westerners, the idea that China will dominate the species dominance debate in the 21st century may seem ludicrous, but consider the following. Agreed, today's China is a political shithole with a dictatorial government that has killed 80 million of its own citizens, 45 million in the Mao-caused Great Famine of 58-62, 27 million in its 1,000 Laogai, slave labour camps for political prisoners, according to Harry Wu, laogaimuseum.org, during the same period, plus more millions during the anti-rightist, that's anti-intellectual, and cultural revolutions. However, China has the world's fastest economic growth rate, so that the rise of its middle class will probably push China into a democracy by about 2020 or so. About 100 countries over the past half-century have done this, according to the branch of political science called Transitology, which studies the transitions from one-party dictatorships to multi-party democracies. The main lesson from the transitologists is that the transition occurs when the proportion of the educated middle class is high enough to pass the democratic threshold. This transition correlates with a given value of the standard of living, that is about $6,000 to $8,000 per year per person. China is now, 2014, at the $6,000 level, and in 2017 I think it's now at about 8,000. So it's now at the top of the range of the transition period at living. China now has about 200,000 violent political demonstrations a year. So the pressure in the political pressure cooker is heating up. The explosion must come, I don't know, let's say very probably within 10 years or less. Okay, back to the essay. Once China has switched to democracy, either by its middle class pushing the CCP, that's Chinese Communist Party, out of power, or pushing it to reform itself into a democratic party and competing with rival Chinese democratic parties, then China will open itself up to the world by allowing international TV, unblocking the internet, YouTube, etc., allowing freedom of speech, scrapping the Laogai, allowing the formation of interest groups, trade unions, etc. China will probably then go through a massive inferiority complex as it becomes conscious of its massive inferiority compared to the advanced Western nations. This in turn will motivate the Chinese, who are on average smarter than Americans and Europeans, with an average IQ of 105, whereas Americans and Europeans have an average IQ of 100. And with comparable creativity scores, according to global creativity studies undertaken by psychologists, to civilize and intellectualize their culture and thus reduce their inferiority complex. For example, today's Chinese have won 0 science Nobel Prizes on their own soil. Well, in 2017, 1, a pathetic 1. They contribute virtually nothing to world culture and are the only country on the planet not to use an alphabet. Their writing system is as archaic as it is stupid, requiring the learning of thousands of squiggles, taking 9 years of schooling instead of 24 letters, taking a month at kindergarten. Today's China is intellectually sterile, hyper-conservative, and a global disgrace. Despite the hefty negativity of the above, I'm predicting that in the 2020s, once China has democratized and become a real member of the world community, a wave of revolutionary creativity will spread across the culture, resulting in it taking the lead from the US in the species dominance debate. I hope to play a role in that transition. Well, maybe indirectly on the internet, but I'll be out of China in a year or two. China has 1.3 billion people. They have the same creativity scores, that is, openness to experience, as used frequently by psychologists who test personality types. Imagine a large city of over 10 million Chinese sages, that is intellectuals, in the top IQ percentile. That is China's fabulous potential. I just hope I don't have to wait too long before it happens and I get too old. Well, I did run out of patience. I'm fed up with this Chinese shithole. So, I predict the first assassinations an artificial brain company and ABBA